Hello and welcome to this special edition of the broadcast. My name is Mohammed Saleh. Now, ever since Russia pulled out of the Ukrainian Black Sea grain deal, what was evident is that Russia had resorted on a strategy where it wanted to use food as a weapon of war. And this is exactly what is playing out, because in the last 24 hours, Russia is said to have fired a barrage of at least about 22 missiles which have specifically targeted the Ukrainian port cities, Odessa being the key among them. Now, this is a deliberate and clearly a thought-out strategy that Russia is now using, where the cost of this war will be experienced not just by Ukraine, but indeed by the rest of the world. Because what will now happen is this. Russia has made it abundantly clear that it will no longer be able to guarantee the safety of even those ships that carry food grain and that leave the Ukrainian port cities. But how will this strategy actually play out in the near future? And why is Russia resorting to a strategy like this? To discuss more on this, we are being joined by Professor James D.J. Brown, who's an international affairs expert, and he's joining us on this broadcast live from Tokyo. Now, Professor Brown, this is something that was expected ever since Russia announced that it was pulling out of the Black Sea grain deal, but to specifically target the port cities of Ukraine effectively now means that the world will witness a shortage of food grains in the next few days to come.
Yes, that's absolutely right. That it might not have been entirely unexpected, but nonetheless, the scenes that we're seeing from Odessa and from other port areas are nonetheless very shocking. And I think that you put it very well in highlighting that this is not only a strike against Ukraine, but will also have major implications for global food supplies. So since this agreement came into force last August, it succeeded in having 33 million tons of wheat being shipped from Ukraine to other countries, with around half of that going to developing states. And so these actions, these shocking actions by Russia, will clearly impact the developing world.
It almost is counterintuitive, isn't it, Professor Brown? Because Russia would, on the one hand, not want to be internationally isolated. It would want to win more support. But by doing what it has done, it is now targeting those nations, not necessarily in the West, but also predominantly in Asia and Africa. Some of these nations have been fairly ambivalent in terms of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Do you think Russia has thought out this strategy and is willing to take the costs that it will face internationally in terms of the isolation that it presently faces?
I think there are two factors which have guided Russian thinking. The first one is actually revenge. These attacks are, I think, linked with the action that was taken against the Crimean bridge, with, as you'll remember, some days ago, explosions damaging the road bridge, which is so militarily and symbolically important for Russia. Absolutely. So I think that's one of the reasons why they took this action. And the second one is that they're trying to use military action to force a renegotiation of the grain deal, because Russia's feeling is that they haven't really benefited themselves from this agreement. Their hope was that the agreement would allow Ukrainian shipments, but would also facilitate Russian agricultural shipments. And so their hope is that they would be able to renegotiate the agreement to enable better terms for their own shipments of grain.
That's an interesting point that you brought out. Do you think the West would be willing to now sit down and negotiate with Russia to try and get it back, to the negotiating table? Because last year, when Russia had said that it would not be able to guarantee the movement of ships in the Black Sea, even those ships that carry the grain deal, Turkey and the United Nations had stepped in to try and get Russia to negotiate some kind of a grain deal. Do you think we'll now look at a more concerted effort by the West to get Russia back to the negotiating table, at least for the grain deal?
Well, I don't think the deal is completely dead. I think that Turkey will play a key role in potentially seeking to persuade the Russian side to re-engage. But I don't think there will be more willingness on the side of Western countries to make compromise. I think instead there will be a determination to help Ukraine even more. And I think the other thing that we're likely to see from this is perhaps really a turning point in opinion in developing countries. As you mentioned earlier, there has been some ambivalence with many countries not really quite sure which side is on the right in this conflict. But with Russia so obviously targeting global food supplies, for many that could really be the tipping point that shifts them against Russia.
Now, what is also important to look at, Professor, is the fact that, countries in Europe, like for instance Britain, have been experiencing a serious cost of living crisis. This is a crisis that's been witnessed in other nations in the West as well. Do you think Europe at this point of time would be more willing to, in fact, try get Russia back into the Black Sea grain deal?
I think there's a willingness to look at various options. There are still possibilities for Ukrainian ships to get out by using different routes through the Black Sea. But I think that European countries, for political reasons, they couldn't allow themselves to be seen to being forced by Russian aggression to make compromises. So no, I don't think that Russia's military action against these logistical infrastructure facilities is going to succeed.
And also what is happening in terms of the war, Professor, is pretty disturbing. On the one hand, we've had this grain deal which has collapsed, and also on the other, we are getting reports of the use of cluster bombs, which the United States had just a few days ago announced that it was sending to Ukraine. And now the reports that are coming in state that Ukraine has already started using these cluster ammunition on the battlefield. We're getting reports that Russia has also been using this cluster ammunition. How do you see this progressing further? Because the longer this war seems to be stretching, the more desperate both nations appear to be in trying to take the other out, which is resulting in a situation where more and more deadly weapons are being used.
Yes, it's very regrettable to see cluster munitions being used. I think the important point to highlight here is that these munitions have been used almost from the start of the conflict by the Russian side. So with Ukraine beginning to use them, it's not so much an escalation from Ukraine, it's rather taking some steps to level the playing field. But nonetheless, it is regrettable. These are weapons that are more likely to lead to civilian casualties due to the fact that many of them malfunction and end up lying on the ground. They serve almost as additional landmines. So it is very regrettable. But it can also be a sign here of maybe further escalation. And the one that, of course, lingers in the background is the fear that, and of course we hope this won't happen, but fear of Russia escalating towards the use of nuclear weapons.
Now, one of the reasons that was given by President Biden as to why the United States sent these cluster ammunitions, because he admitted it candidly, that the United States is low on weapons that it can spare for Ukraine. With that being the case, do you think the West is now reaching a certain stage where it may not be in a position to help out Ukraine as much as it may want to in terms of the weapons that it can ship to Ukraine?
Yes, I think that's already happening, but it's not something which is across the board. Rather, what we have is that in certain areas, certain types of weapon, we're seeing particularly shortages. And this conflict has really been surprising even to very seasoned military observers of just the scale of the use of weapons, ammunition being used in such huge volumes. Now, it's in part just a question of time. You are having weapons producers increasing their production, and in time that will enable more supplies to come through to Ukraine. But that takes time. It's not something that can be done in a matter of days. Right. So one of the ideas connected with the cluster munitions is that it might cover a period of time when Ukraine is short of other weapons, but those would then be supplied later on.
And also my final question to you, Professor, is this. For several months we were waiting for the Ukrainian counteroffensive, but the Ukrainian counteroffensive has now been on for over a month. But what is clearly evident is that the counteroffensive does not seem to be making any kind of a major headway or a breakthrough in breaking through the Russian defense ranks. With this being the case, do you think that the West would now be more willing to prod the Ukrainians to have some kind of negotiations with Russia?
I think it's too early, really, to make any conclusions in that regard. Anyone who kind of really understood the situation on the ground never had expectations that this was going to lead to sudden breakthroughs. Defense is always easier than attack. Russia knew this counteroffensive was being prepared, and they dug into very well prepared positions. So it was never going to be easy, but progress is being made. And I think that we'll have to see what happens in the coming weeks. But I think that more progress will take place. The counteroffensive has not failed.
All right. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Brown, for joining us and getting us all those insights. But as things stand at this moment, it's difficult to predict as to which way and which direction this war will go. But what is quite abundantly clear is that with the Black Sea grain deal having failed, the world will, of course, be paying a much higher cost in terms of the scarcity of food that several nations around the world will now experience, and also the cost of living crisis that many other nations have already been dealing with. Thank you very much indeed to Professor Brown for again joining us.